Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first edition of AGS Live for 2023. My name's Dave Barr, and I am your host and facilitator today for today's webinar, where we'll be looking at the economy and your workforce. I think, given the audience we have today, and thank you to everybody, our clients and everybody else who's joined us this morning, I think both these topics are things that are probably being discussed almost daily or hourly in your organizations today. And we only need to look at today's media to see that both the economy and the workforce are headlines across Australian news, with the government's announcement today about stripping the RBA board's ability and right to set interest rates, which is obviously the key lever for inflation in Australia. And we'll obviously need to see what that impact is to the economy. And Claire O'Neill, the Minister for Home Affairs, has announced that she'll be addressing the Australian Press Club next week to talk about the government's framework around migration, which I think we all know is a key enabler for workforce and the labour market here in Australia. And I think if we reflect on the Skills Summit from last year, and any of you who are following it, the commentary around some of the gaps in the data that was used to review the framework. Some commentators would suggest it was almost 20 years old, which, if we think about the labour market today in Australia and the skills and where we have chronic skills shortages, they're radically different to what we were encountering 20 years ago. So I guess by way of introduction, I head up the AGS business across Australia and New Zealand. I am not an economist, just to be clear, but I have spent the last 23 years working in the talent space. I've been very privileged to have worked across a number of different regions. More recently, I've been up in Asia up until last year, where I co-founded a recruitment outsourcing business before returning back to Australia last year. I'm really excited about the panel that we've pulled together today. We've got some amazing experience and guests. First of all, we have Dan Beck, who's the Senior Vice President of Applications with our partner Beeline. Dan is a graduate of Berkeley. He started his career at Accenture, worked in management consulting, and he's had stints with the likes of Hewlett-Packard and Workday, before co-founding a business in Silicon Valley, Utmost, which was recently purchased by Beeline, who are one of the world's leading and preeminent workforce management platforms. So, evening or afternoon, Dan, great to have you on the show today. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Dave. Great to be here.
Brilliant. We're also joined by Justin Dooley. Justin is a senior manager for our market insights practice at AGS. He runs a team of research analysts who spend their lives looking at how the global economy and markets impact how we run our business. He's had over a decade working across the TA and market analytics space, and he's currently based up in Manila and supports us from a regional perspective. So Justin, morning, great to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Dave, and good morning.
Brilliant, my pleasure. And Justin's got a microphone, so I feel, even though I am the host, I'm certainly trumped by his kit. So maybe next time I'll get myself sorted with regards to a microphone. But so during today's webinar, we're going to really look at two key areas. I'm going to turn to our experts throughout the session to get their views and insights around topics. And the first topic we're going to look to Justin to cover is, what are some of the global economic indicators we're seeing? And given the interconnectivity and reliance the Australian economy has on global markets, how are we seeing some of these interventions or events spill over to how we manage our day-to-day lives here in Australia? Also looking at that through a workforce lens. I'll then be turning to Dan, who I think is one of the world's leading experts and gurus when it comes to supporting companies and brands around managing their external workforce and looking at how they use data to make really strong, informed and good decisions when it comes to the extended workforce. But before I do, I think just a couple of housekeeping matters. And as I said early on, this session is really designed to you, our audience. Yeah, we're delighted to have you with us. We appreciate you being generous with your time and taking time out of your day to listen to us talk today. But if there's anything you would like further clarity on, or if you have any questions, we have a chat facility in GoToWebinar, and I'll be looking to feed out some of those questions, all the tricky ones, to Justin and Dan to make sure that they can share their insights and expertise. So please do drop the chat. We've provisioned for time at the end of today's session to answer any of the questions you, our audience, might have. I guess just to frame today's session as well, I think it's really important as a group, and I guess all of us working in intertwined and interlinked industries, all really focusing in on people and talent and workforce. I think it's important for us to pause and reflect on where we've come from. And I think it's fair to say over the last 3 years, we've seen unprecedented volatility when it comes to economic climates. And you only need to think that it was 38 short months ago, all of us were sat here in February 2020, blissfully unaware of what the world was about to go through. Most of us in professional roles were probably working in the office Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, days bookended with commutes, etc., which we know now has completely changed. And then all of a sudden, we were thrust into what was the worst health crisis in over 100 years. Very quickly, we saw governments scramble and intervene to protect their citizens, not only from some of the fallout in terms of health issues, but we saw them make some very strong interventions when it came to economic policies as well. And again, trying to protect people's workforce and national working and productivity. Here in Australia, we saw total parts of the economy shut down. If we think about aviation, hospitality, tourism, etc., and we saw the most rapid reshaping of our labour markets and workforce in history, where we saw lots of people displaced from industries, go find gainful employment in other sectors. And as we came out of COVID, many of those haven't returned. So we have a completely reshaped labour market and workforce here. And then almost as quickly as we went into COVID, and I know for most of us on this call today, it won't feel like it, but we came out of it rapidly. And those of you working in the talent space in 2021 would have seen, we saw this tsunami of demand from organizations looking to ramp up really rapidly and really quickly. And we saw the skills market and chronic skill shortages really struggling to keep up. And we see that pace of acceleration carry on through 2022 as well. If we think about, terms of how we lived our lives, I mean, one of the statistics that always brings it to focus for me is, I think we all agree pre-COVID video calls were a bit of a novelty and a bit of a kind of rare thing. And if you look at the Zoom statistics from December 2019 to March 2020, they went from 8 million subscribers on a daily basis to well over 200 million subscribers. So our entire working lives completely shifted. And I think as we look to 2023, I think it's fair to say, again, with the announcements in the papers today, we're predicting another turbulent year. We've seen, obviously, the Ukraine crisis, energy crisis, pushing inflation to record levels. And despite some of the kind of negative narrative around economy, we're seeing the jobs market, really, and the unemployment figures stay, at record lows. So if we think about unemployment in Australia today, sitting at 3.5%, that hasn't really shifted, even though we've seen, a big change in terms of the economic outlook over the last few months. And if we look at some of the other data supporting the jobs market as well, the SEEK data around job advertisements, yes, we've seen a modest decrease in terms of the number of ads through February and March of this year when we compare it to the previous year, but we've also seen a sharp decline in the number of applicants. So again, that would suggest, the supply and demand relationship is still very much out of kilter. And we've also seen the ABS numbers for last month when it comes to hours worked increasing, which again would suggest that the workforce here in Australia is working increasing hours, which would suggest that, jobs creation is going to still be a topic over the coming months, probably in, certain skill areas rather than others. So I guess with this, I'm going to look to Justin first and foremost. Justin, look, can you give us an insight into and help us understand what's happening in the current global environment and how this is going to impact our lives and our working lives from a talent perspective here in Australia?
All right. Thank you, Dave. Now, with the pandemic mostly behind us, we are really dealing with its lasting effects on the global economy. Most notably, the rising inflation rates in the United States. With their economy being as large as it is, their interest rates effectively carry over to other markets as collateral damage, and really, Australia is no exception. This inflation is no longer constrained to shortages of components. It has even affected the overall prices of goods and, in turn, increased pressure for wage hikes. While we may not necessarily enter an economic recession, we are at a risk of companies entering what is called an earnings recession instead, as it must meet the increasing costs of not just overall goods, but also the wage requirements of employees. And we are already experiencing these effects in our markets. Demand has started to slow down. We are also seeing companies effectively downsizing in order to meet revenue targets. And I guess with that out of the way, I think we can shift our focus and look at Australia and how it has mostly dealt with the current market today. So, as Dave mentioned earlier, at first glance, Australia is doing rather well, comparatively speaking. Around the same time 3 years ago, unemployment rate was at 5.1%, but as of late, this has dropped to an historical low of just 3.5%. Now, on the surface, this is rather impressive. The government and central banks have effectively made policies to counteract the global effects of inflation. However, this unemployment rate also highlights a major concern the country is facing right now, and Dave alluded to that earlier, and that is the skills shortages and the skills gap from the Australian workforce. While the unemployment rate is at an all time low, the labor participation rate, sitting at 66%, is a major point of concern. For context, there are over 50,000 job vacancies as of February, most of which are from the healthcare sector looking for nurses, or the technology sector and its need for stronger software development skills, or even just the construction sector as well, to name a few. This in turn has actually prompted the government to thoroughly review its migration policies for skilled workers, even as far as fast tracking worker visas for those that fall under the growing number of its skilled occupation list. Now, despite all this, Australia is still slated for growth. In fact, its GDP has been higher than ever at 3.6% as of last year, though these numbers are projected to fall to just 2% by the end of this year as the country catches up to the effects of the global markets, rising inflation, as well as the overall economic slowdown. In our next slide, we'll look at how this effect has started to take place today. At the end of the first quarter, the market started to decelerate. Australia's hiring rate is now at a 35% deficit year on year based on LinkedIn's job posting data. This trend of demand slowing down has also started to creep into the workforce as job searching intensity is also increased. Workers feel like they need to secure a new job to meet their wages and other work related requirements before it's too late. While 35% doesn't seem like such a huge decline, it's still worth noting that certain sectors in the country continue to grow in demand. In March alone, oil and gas had a growth rate of 75% in job postings due to the war in Ukraine and subsequently Europe's need for alternative resources. The government administration also increased hiring by 42%. Hospitals and healthcare rose by 36%, education up by 35%, and lastly, retail at 34%. Now, what this all means is that emphasis must be shifted to the gap left behind by the shortage in the workforce. These sectors are what Australia needs the most right now. And that about sums it up for Australia's current market. Before we move further, we will be looking at the contingent workforce itself. Now, contingent staffing continues to be a strong point for the country, with revenue growth at a healthy 86% from contingent work alone. This is also evident in the workforce, with over 1.4 million, or roughly 10% of the country's working population, classified as contingent workers. Apart from being a major supplier of workers, Australia is also one of the leading sources and clients that provide contingent work itself, comprising about 7% of the work available from the major regions. Now, we are all aware of some of the reasons why individuals choose to be contingent workers, whether it's flexibility or autonomy of work, a pursuit of passion, or simply a need to diversify one's experience. But as employers, we get the flexibility to scale our workforce accordingly, depending on the business. We get cost savings and access to a large pool of workers with specialized skill sets. However, contingent work is not without its downsides. For one, there are still concerns about compensation along with health and safety claims. Others have also cited problems regarding their wages and time compliance. Some have called out misclassifications in their employment type as well. There are also constant complaints about discrimination in the workforce, even till today. Labor hire employers are called upon to ensure these concerns are addressed in order to maintain a healthy and thriving workforce. In the next slide, we'll talk more about notable strategies around this. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. We all know it, we all talk about it, and we all want to properly implement it. And that call to action will continue to grow as more of the Gen Z enter the workforce in the coming years. Flexibility is no longer constrained to the workplace, but also in the hours of work, whether it's complete autonomy in schedules, lesser days of work, or something similar to that. We are experiencing the demand for what is now called hyper flexibility in the workplace. Well being is no longer just about reacting to one's mental health, but by also taking a proactive approach in ensuring that the work environment itself is free from mental stress. And as simple as it sounds, we all just want to recognize our workers. Happiness and satisfaction go a long way towards worker retention. Even studies have shown that a happy workforce is less likely to look elsewhere for employment. It is our obligation to provide a healthy organizational culture. We want to retain our workforce by addressing their needs and concerns, enhancing this workforce through skills based hiring or looking at upskilling talent that is already available to us. And lastly, providing that flexibility everyone so desires whenever possible. Now, apart from the emphasis on workers itself, we can also look at what we can do to improve the work itself. In our next slide, we will be able to see that proper investments in technology, infrastructure, and overall security in the workplace leads to growth in revenues and increased worker satisfaction. Based on a report by the National Skills Commission, we can see the various returns of these investments through productivity, worker retention, cost savings, and revenue, to name a few. In fact, this can lead to a growth of as much as 7% on average. While all this may not come as a surprise, really, we are still seeing a lot of companies lagging behind in providing the necessary investments to truly address the needs of workers. In a survey conducted, more than half are still not satisfied with their flexibility in work arrangements, nor do they have the necessary tools and applications to conduct their work remotely. A lot are still asking for better technology implementations, particularly cloud based ones. And lastly, security is still not up to par to fully enable remote work. Now, to summarize all of that, I think we can look at really three main things. First would be workforce strategies must address future needs. In this case, we are already faced with a skill shortage from various growing sectors that we can fill through effective skills based hiring. Second would be to upskill our resources through training and other methods to be able to fill more vacancies. And lastly, we really want to listen to our workers, their needs, their concerns, and what would make them generally more satisfied in the work that they do. And that about concludes my part in this section, but over to you, Dave.
Cool, thank you, Justin. Yeah, no, appreciate your insights. And yeah, like I think if everyone on the line is anything like me, it's a really complicated picture. If we read the headlines almost daily, there's negative narrative around economic conditions. Yeah, we're seeing the big R word back on the radar in terms of recession. Though despite that, I guess for all of us who work either directly in the talent space or associated fields to it, it probably doesn't feel like that. The pendulum hasn't really swung when it comes to behaviors from applicants and candidates, etc. And I think Justin, you make some great points there that despite the talk of economic slowdown and despite highly publicized layoffs in certain sectors, I think if we look at technology in particular, many of us are still grappling with trying to, especially in Australia, correct those chronic shortages. And there are certain sectors that, given the structural changes to our labour force here in Australia, will probably spend the best part of the next few years trying to manage that and correct it. And I think that sort of leads me on to, I guess, a really important point. And again, I'm going to turn to Dan here. I think how we navigate this complicated world, which is, we're, never in the, in the history of the world have we had more access to information. I think it's fair to say as an industry, we're lagging when it comes to data and the ability to use data well and meaningful data to manage our businesses. But almost all of us in leadership roles in any business are going to be required to translate all of these mixed messages to make good decisions about how we manage our organization, our workforces, extended employee workforces, whichever they may be, to help drive productivity. And I think we all, would love to hear, Dan, your insights. I mean, you've worked with companies all over the world, some of the world's most, prominent and leading brands across many sectors. What is it you're seeing in terms of, the data and economic factors influencing how people run their extended workforce today, Dan?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Dave. Great to be here. I appreciate letting a Californian sneak into the APAC webinar. It's I will offer, for those of you in Australia, I have binge watched all of the Hamish and Andy episodes. I regret that they're no longer really on the air, though if you looked at some of the recent use of them asking ChatGPT what they think about them, it's a pretty good listen. And for those of you in Singapore, I spent a year living in Singapore working on a big project for the government, the Ministry of Finance. Lived right off of Orchard Road. So great to be here. As far as Californians go, I'm hopefully sensitive to the area. And we've got some great clients, existing Beeline customers on the call. Bronwyn asked me to say hi to you, Georgie. So thanks for joining, and other great activities. To your question, Dave, I see this as just such an exciting time. Like the reality, you alluded to it, Justin just touched on it as well. The reality is that what's happening given the macro environment is companies are taking a really hard look at their workforce. And in general terms, they are realizing that they have wild blind spots, like wild gaps in, particularly as it pertains to the extended workforce. So those non-employees doing work for the organization. In general terms, I spent 10 years of my career at Workday. For those of you using sort of Workday's HR product, I led the kind of technology products team. And one of the reasons I started Upmost, the firm that Beeline acquired last year, and part of what we're going to see from Beeline is a wave of new innovation coming from that acquisition, as well as our other innovations, is, I saw this secular shift in real terms of how work's getting done, shifting from employee to interesting, like massive populations of non-employee. There's an Ardent Partner study that just came out saying that since 2010, the total global population of non-employees has gone from 20% to 49%. So it doesn't take a mathematician to imagine how exciting we are here, because I think a lot of the attendees are program leads responsible for that continued program, ideally in partnership with AGS, our partner. And what an exciting time where we're going to live through not just all the exciting change you just mentioned, Dave, but this inflection point where the majority of the global working population is non-employed. And so you see the slide here. I don't know, should I walk through this a little bit, Dave?
Yeah, please.
I feel like I'm overstaying my welcome with your first question to me. But at some level, answering this question, how many people are doing work on behalf of your organization, is surprisingly hard for companies to answer. Now, this session is not intended to be a Beeline pitch. I am here representing Beeline. We have a new offering called Global Workforce Intelligence, aiming to make this easy to answer. So it's one of these, this is a hard problem and we can help. If we jump to the next slide. But if you look something like the stats on this next slide, you're not alone. So what we see in practice with some of the world's largest and best brands, large life sciences companies, large consumer goods companies, companies operating in the global 500, the kind of brands you use every day, is that on average, they have less than 10% of their non-employee population captured in any system of record. So if you have large populations of workers, service-based contracts, freelancers, you name it, fixed term contracts, and you're not sure if your current vendor management system handles them, you're not alone. And what we see, to answer the question more bluntly, Dave, is companies are now saying, we're getting into tough times. We need to take a hard look at what we're spending on our workforce, and we need better answers to the questions. The company,
Yeah, Dan, I was going to ask. Sorry to interrupt and cut across you, but yeah, I mean you touch a really interesting point. There's obviously a visibility standpoint, knowing where the work's being done, what work's being done by who, but there's also this big cost question. And if your stats there saying that 49% of the workforce might be made up of extended workforce, there's a delta there of what, 10 and 49, 39% of your potential cost when it comes to labor is potentially unaccounted for or very difficult to get a view on. Is that a topic you're seeing, especially in the last few months?
Even more than that. Exactly. So the client down the middle of this large pharmaceutical company, they did a webinar with another member of our team last week. They talked about one of the primary benefits, the reason they went with this. You kind of see the VMS plus GWI. I know that's bad form to have so many acronyms on a slide, but their existing VMS combined with global workforce intelligence, that part of the driver was that with the hard data that they got out of having global workforce intelligence in production, that a full 20% of their non-employee population was misclassified from a contract. So instead of being a contingent contract, they were sort of hiding, if you will, in a service-based contract with markups of between 30 and 100%. Tens of millions of dollars of hard savings from that finding alone. And part of our thesis is, as you have better data, you'll just make better decisions and move up that maturity curve of more sophisticated workforce decisions, starting with cost and then moving up to more of a skills-based mindset, trade-offs between employees and non-employees, different categories of non-employees, different geographies, lots of choices, of course. And there's another key part of this. I mean, this is the reality that we see in practice. Vast populations. I'm not talking like 100 workers here, 20 workers there. We're talking like 33,000 workers around the globe. The other side of this is compliance. And if we hit the next slide, companies are facing, the folks on the call probably are facing an unprecedented change in the amount of compliance, rules, and regulations that you need to keep up with. Now, I know in Australia, they passed the Fair Labor Amendment in December of last year. That is going to have profound changes in employment rules and regulations in Australia. But I'm here in California in the United States. You've probably heard of IR35 in the UK. In February of this year, the EU passed new legislation focused on what, among other things, flexible working arrangements. And it looks like the UK is going to follow suit. And so what we see in practice again is that the vast majority of our customers at the high end of the market are in 15 countries. So you have this complex web of rules and regulations as governments are struggling to keep up with this unprecedented change in the workforce because they're not sure what to do with all of these different contract types, casuals, fixed term, freelance, lots of different language for it. And yet you as an organization are being asked to represent that across multiple different jurisdictions, sometimes with not just jurisdiction sort of legislation, employment legislation, but also industry best practices. And so one of the things, last thing, again, not intended to be a plug, is part of global workforce intelligence is to offer compliance rules built into it with what we call a kind of compliance rules engine to proactively alert these things, starting at the foundational level, tenure, cost, what's happening, moving up to those employment regulations by jurisdictions you're operating in, and of course, getting to tax regs, industry regs, and then your company policies, even something as simple as saying, I want to track whether all of the people doing work for my brand have agreed to my code of conduct. All the folks that have access to my network have signed my cybersecurity agreements. These are real world tangible things that we can help with, and of course in partnership with you. So anyway, enough slides for me, but intellectually, I see two major trends. One, the genie is out of the bottle. We are not going to go back to employee only relationships. 49% and growing. We are actually at an interesting inflection point where the way we fundamentally organize companies is materially different. And then secondly, governments are going to be scrambling to catch up, and that is going to require yet more flexibility to be aware of this changing and possibly overlapping set of compliance regulations that are required for you to keep up with. And and every day there's a new one coming out. So I think we need software to help you, trusted partners and software to help you.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think you touched on a really important topic around the intersection of employee and non-employed workforce. I think here in Australia, we are seeing more and more customers and organizations moving toward a skill-based kind of workforce. So, and again, I think, with government regulations ever changing, compliance, depending on the sector you're in, greater compliance if you're in financial services or some of the entertainment companies, which are highly topical at the moment with casinos, etc. There are skills that you're required to mobilize, not necessarily on an ongoing or permanent basis. So, how do you achieve your corporate and strategic goals with your workforce, and not, obviously entirely build your workforce with employees only, because a lot of these skills won't necessarily be required in the future. They're potentially interim. And I think the governments, and again, I'm not speaking of the government in any way, but they're grappling with how to deal with this. There was an article last week in the Australian around youth employment and a huge spike in youth employment to offset the ability for small organizations and small businesses in particular to be able to keep running, because they're just simply not able to be able to mobilize workers quick enough or at all to manage and run their businesses. So they're turning to youth employment. The government framework is out of date. How do we manage that? The awards framework is not necessarily set up to capture and manage that. So there's going to be reforms, no doubt. And most of you on the line would be aware of the same job, same pay reforms that are going on, which will clearly have a profound impact on how organizations manage labor hire or contingent workers. Obviously, it's an ongoing discussion, and the government's interacting with industry. So mercifully, there was a paper released last week on it, and they've asked industry leaders and experts to commentate and provide submissions to this. So hopefully there's a way forward on it. But I guess, Dan, in terms of any sort of future predictions, and again, looking at sort of sectors or customers within your world, are there any particular industries or sectors that you're seeing focus on their kind of data and workforce management more than others, or is it pretty much you seeing it across the entire spectrum of your? Appreciate you work with a huge number of customers globally.
Yeah, I think it's widespread in financial services. It's widespread in life sciences and pharma, but I see pretty consistent patterns of larger and larger reliance on. It's not just a casual reliance on non-employee labor. It's a dependence. It's a workforce strategy, right? You start having tens of thousands of folks or even hundreds working for your brand, like that is really a valuable way of how you get things done. And so what we see, those are some of the industries we see very prominently. But even, I don't know, there was new regulations in the States here for the airline industry, and I think there's some similar new changes affecting the rail industry in Australia, where you just need to know new data about your entire workforce, be it employee or non, didn't matter, of where they were born and their birth date. And so this was new information, something you need to go gather against, hundreds, if not thousands of folks have been working with you for some time. And even just keeping up with that obligation is pretty challenging. So my prediction, I guess, is I think the genie's out of the bottle. I think we are not going to see some of the legislation. I think the early legislation was kind of about, like, wasn't it great when we were all employed by someone, right? It was sort of this, like, try to put the genie back into the bottle. Some of the newer legislation, and I think there's kind of questions coming in. We encourage your questions because we want to have an active discussion here. Is around pay parity, pay parity for contractors, contingent labor versus full-time folks, collective bargaining opportunities, and so I think that is just going to continue. We are going to see more. I think you're going to see more legislation, not less. But I think the legislation is going to be seeking a balance of fairness. It's going to be less trying to put the genie back into the bottle and make everyone an employee. And it's going to be more about basic questions of fairness for casuals, for fixed term contracts, et cetera. And that's going to require data to answer the question. And I think that the key thing that we haven't yet talked about, because it's so challenging right now, Dave, is how companies are going to start driving real competitive advantage with the full might of their workforce, right? How you orchestrate a workforce, employees and extended workforce for competitive advantage to move more quickly, because I'll tell you right now, I'm in the heart of Silicon Valley here in California. The best, everyone's talking about data and ChatGPT, and I made a joke about it earlier, but the best machine learning engineers in the world, they don't want to work for you. Like they want to do a gig for you. They want to do a project for you. And they want to keep doing that. They want 2 or 3 projects simultaneously. So actually reaching some of the best talent out there is almost tantamount to saying, I need to work with someone that is going to be a freelancer or is going to be a fixed term contract for me. And that's creating interesting challenges, because the companies that are figuring that out are driving faster products, faster, better competitive advantage.
Yeah, perfect. And Dan, you touched on a good point. Yeah, we have had a couple of questions running through, and we'll try and get through as many of those as we can. I guess first question is probably, I was hoping to send everything curly to both of you, but it looks like I'm probably going to be on the spotlight here. But we've had a question we've had a question in saying the market is seeing large global IT organizations, consultancies and other organizations reduce their workforce. And this is a plea, it sounds like. Why haven't we seen an increase in the number of candidates available in the market? So I'll take a stab at that one. I think, yeah, it's undoubtedly, through the COVID times and, just after, consumer spending, a lot of it was focused on, kind of technology and, online type activities. And we saw again, a huge uptick in hiring. And I think we've probably seen a correction in the last little while, and consumer spending shifting away from those sorts of things and going back into some of the more traditional discretionary spending markets, tourism, hospitality, people eating out again, etc. So I think there's just been a natural correction there in terms of revenues from companies, and they've obviously downsized. But I think what we've seen, and again, I'm not speaking on behalf of the entire industry, but we've seen a lot of non-core roles within tech firms are the ones that have typically been displaced, and not necessarily core technology roles. So I don't think we've seen yet in Australia in particular a real shift in the supply of talent just yet. And I think if we're talking about the cost of hiring, whether it's contingent or otherwise, we certainly haven't seen any form of kind of stabilization when it comes to wages or rate increases. That still is kind of ticking. I think it's more modest than what it was a year ago, but I still feel like we've certainly not seen a massive release on that. We've got another question here around job adverts and how we look at, and I think it's a really good point, how the metric is used considering job ads are potentially placed in multiple posts, multiple locations, and sometimes by multiple recruitment partners. I think it's a fair point. I think it's the government's move to recognizing jobs data via Seek, which is, I think, potentially the most widely used platform. And I know they've invested heavily in terms of being able to filter their data to suggest so they're not having duplicate roles, etc. So that's hopefully that gives you an idea. I mean, I'm not sort of passing the buck to Seek, but the jobs data in terms of ads is basically coming from that forum. We've got another question here. What have you uncovered through your research to understand where the cost of contingent workforce sits? So, is it specifically within? We're trying to. Sorry if I'm misunderstanding where the cost of contingent workforce sits. So I think this is probably one for you, Dan. It's basically asking when we're trying to work out the unclassified costs for workers, through, I guess, an exercise you or we would undertake, through an MSP deployment, VMS deployment, where are those costs at normally? Where are they? And I use the word hidden, but that may be a little bit of an exaggeration or a stretch too far, but where are you finding that those costs or unrecognized costs are sat?
I mean, I'm not sure I totally understand the question. I'll try to answer it, and maybe the person can pile on if it's not hitting the mark. But they certainly sit with the budget owner, and it's sort of, there's a real good amount of rigor in general terms for most organizations for heads and headcount, and that goes through a certain process, right? I need a head to do the following, a person to do the following, and that goes through like real rigor with finance and HR and a whole, talent acquisition, a whole sequence. But then you say, but I've got a budget, and next there are 100 people show up and they're doing something for you. And so as far as the raw cost savings, we're seeing a lot of, the one example I mentioned, a lot of cost savings. There's classification needs for compliance reasons, but part of the classification objective for that client in particular, and I don't think they're alone in this, is that they are finding cost savings because work is getting done and classified into the wrong contractual arrangements. And because of that, it has less scrutiny. And so, I think for probably the majority of the folks on the call, if you go back to my data slide, and we don't need to go back to the slide, but intellectually, we're not talking about like a 5 or a 10% blind spot. In some organizations, and these are sophisticated global 100, global 500 multinationals with lots of good management rigor, they might have a 60, a 70, even an 80% blind spot on their non-employee population. So, so how do you control costs? How do you understand what's happening out there if you've got an 80% blind spot? Part of our thesis for introducing global workforce intelligence is you don't. You're doing the best you can with the population you're aware of, but you're kind of vaguely aware there might be, someone with a budget that has a lot of other folks. So I think the budget is all over the shed. IT is a common one. Operations, folks kind of in the production line, like they're trying to get things done, but they oftentimes don't have the rigor to put it through a proper process to drive down the cost that a typical CW program partnered with an MSP would have the rigor to do. So in a good way, I think the program you probably already have in place, you just start bringing in these adjacent populations and then start to make better workforce decisions. You asked me an important question earlier, Dave. What's my prediction? I gave kind of a dull prediction. More compliance regulation. Who wants to hear that? A more optimistic prediction, a more sublime prediction is, I think with better data and, candidly better tools, companies are going to start making much more sophisticated workforce decisions, particularly in that point of decision making of sourcing. Like, how do I get work done? And the most sophisticated companies I've talked to, they're backing up and saying, don't tell me you need a contingent worker. Back up and tell me you need to get some work done. And then we will guide you to the right outcome, because there are a growing number of options for how to get work done. And that's an exciting time. I mean, that creates real opportunity for, I think our shared customers to move up that sophistication chain.
Yeah, no, I'm 100% with you. And yeah, like, as a bit of a dinosaur from the industry, I think, there's never been a more exciting time. There's lots of change. Yes, okay, there's a bit of negative overtone for certain things, but how we operate with our customers and how we help our customers achieve their strategic goals is probably never been more important over the last 3 years. And I predict, like you, that the next few years will be much the same. I am very conscious of time, and that we've obviously we're running up against the time we allocated to the webinar. And again, I want to thank everybody who's dialed in and joined us today. We're really, really grateful for your generosity and giving up your time to listen to us speak. We'll obviously be hosting these more regularly from here on, and we'll be sharing some video content off the back of today's webinar. I'd love to thank both Dan and Justin. Great to have you both with me this morning. Really appreciate you giving up your time, Dan, especially on the Californian coast in the wee hours of the afternoon. Really grateful to have you here and to partner with Beeline. Thank you.
And Dave, I got to say, you guys are such a fantastic partner. I'm working very closely with our Asia Pac team. We would love to partner with some of the folks on the call. I think there's a great opportunity here to do something special. So as you have interest, don't be shy in reaching out to us, because our team on the ground there is really actively working with you and your teams. Yep. And I think, all the magic happens when the next time we do this webinar, we're sitting there with a shared case study for another great great customer. I think that's, you know, a great customer we can serve. So I'm absolutely
Absolutely.
looking forward to that. Not just because I'm trying to angle a trip to Sydney, but I
There you
wouldn't
go.
be opposed to it. Yeah, getting back.
We're coming into winter here, so you might want to time it for, you know, the Q3, Q4 might be a better time to be here. But
Well
we look
played.
forward to hosting you when you're in town. And Justin, it's great to have you and have you here. And thanks for sharing your insights. And on behalf of our team, thanks for all the work you and your team do for us. It's you know, an important part of our offering to our customers. So really appreciate your support.
Yeah, thank you for having me here, and hopefully we can do this more often.
Yeah, no, likewise. With that in mind, there are two special people I want to thank as well. These things don't happen by accident. Karen Tan, you're a legend. Thank you for your support in getting today's session up and running. I'd like to thank my my esteemed colleague here in Sydney, Nat Martin. You're a legend. Appreciate your support. And Bronwyn from Beeline locally, thank you for your support. Without further ado, I'll bring the webinar to a close. Hopefully, you, our audience, and have taken a few nuggets of intel or information or ideas away from today. That's, you know, very much our ambition of these sessions, is to help share industry insights and ideas. We look forward to hosting you again in the future. And please, as Dan mentioned, reach out to any of us after today's session. We'd love to talk to you either one-to-one or, you know, with your execs, etc. If there's any information we can help you with as we navigate the topsy-turvy world of what's going on here in Australia. So thanks all, and enjoy the rest of your day wherever you may be in Australia or elsewhere in the world. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.